Hello everyone, welcome to our asynchronous lecture here. I appreciate you allowing me to teach you in this way this week. So I'm going to jump right in. I have essentially a quick lecture to go through to help you, and it'll be somewhat interactive. So there will be times where I'm going to ask you to pause and practice some of these things. So you want to give yourself some time to be able to go through this. So I'm going to go ahead and start. So again, last week we talked about the literacy demands when it comes to vocabulary acquisition in our instruction. And so this week is really focused on what are some strategies that we can use to help our students meet those literacy demands in our content area. And so as you can see from my objective, we're going to acquire strategies for integrating the Common Core language standards into your or our teaching practice. So let's get right into it. Let's review really quick some of those literacy demands, or what the state is expecting of you in terms of how to integrate academic vocabulary acquisition into your content area. So first standard that you have to address all of you, obviously English, we're going to have a separate lecture about the grammatical standards, and we'll do that later, and you can look at that on Canvas. But this is more universal. Every content area, you're all going to have to focus on language standard 4. You're going to have to help students determine or clarify the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases by using such strategies like context clues, analyzing word parts, and consulting general and specialized reference materials when needed. So that's the standard. So as you're teaching your content, there are going to be these kind of unknown or multiple meaning words and phrases within your instruction. And instead of always just defining those words for them or giving strategies, or you providing instructional or instructor-based strategies, it's also helpful to help students become independent word learners. And that's what language standard 4 is really all about. So I drew an example from 11-12 so that you can kind of see what it is that you're supposed to be doing, but I kind of clarified in the prior slide. But you can see here, so your students are going to determine the meaning of unknown words using, or again, choosing flexibly from a range of strategies. And you can see here using context clues, identifying word patterns, consulting specialized reference materials, and even making kind of educated guesses and then checking those with reference materials or any of these other strategies. So these are the different strategies that you want to teach, again, for the purpose of having them become independent word learners. So I want to model some of that for you. So teaching vocabulary in context. This is what I always used to help my students understand. Sometimes there are words that don't really need to be identified. Students don't need to look up every single word or know the meaning of every single word to make sense of a text. Now, I know that seems somewhat counterintuitive. Obviously, we want students to know words. But if we give student a text to read, or even in our oral instruction is the text that they're processing, students have to kind of be judicious and identify which words are they unfamiliar with. And so that's the first part of that standard, is determining those unknown words, or those words that have a different meaning or are being used in the context, or the way they're used in the context have a different meaning than what I'm used to. And so that's the word that students first have to identify. The next step I always ask my students, if I'm reading something, or even if I'm just helping them learn these independent word learner strategies, is to determine whether that word, that unknown word, or that word that seems to have a different meaning than I'm used to, whether it's necessary for understanding. If I can look at that word and I'm like, I guess that's not as important, I kind of get the gist of the message, the main idea, then I don't need to waste a lot of time being hung up on that word. But if the word, as it's used in the text that's being provided to students, is necessary for them to understand what it is they need to understand, whatever the idea might be, then that's when I have them go to step 3, which is determine what strategy would be best. So that could be, is there context clues that would help support an understanding of that word? If not, are there other strategies I can use? Do I have a knowledge and understanding of Greek word parts and Latin word parts, so I can look at certain word parts and go, well, I know what that word part means this, and so that might help me understand what this word might mean. And so then you have students apply that strategy, or maybe a multitude of strategies. Maybe use the word parts, maybe you're using context together, maybe use a word part and then you use the dictionary, maybe you guess and then use the dictionary. There's lots of different ways. And then students check their comprehension to see if that makes sense. So again, teaching in context, what we have done really poorly as educators in the past is coming up with these word banks and having students just memorize a bunch of words and then testing them on their knowledge of words. And that, again, as I talked about last week, is not the best strategy for helping students acquire and retain a robust vocabulary. And so I would teach words in context, waiting for those words to arise that students are unfamiliar with, and then giving them, again, opportunities to use strategies to uncover those unfamiliar words. I want to say again, it would be really, really challenging for you to have to teach directly every single word that you think students know or don't know. And especially with the variety of students that you have in your class, and depending on how much word knowledge they have, that could be a really daunting task for you as a teacher. So teaching vocabulary in context, using these skills to help students become independent word learners is actually a bigger bang for your buck. It saves you time, gives you, or allows you to empower your students to learn words for themselves instead of you having to be the one they rely on to define unknown words for them. Okay, so let's get to some examples here. So I gave this as my example here for kind of applying some of these strategies. So the 5 types of context clues. So if you're going to help students use this strategy, what I would recommend is defining for them and giving them some practice. This could be a quick warm up in class of what the different types of context clues are, right? And so if a student is reading something and they recognize that, okay, the word haberdashery, I have no idea what that word means. And I've now determined, going back to my steps, that this is a word that I need to know in order to comprehend the content that I'm learning. I can use the strategy of context clues. And these are the clues that I might need to look for. It's funny when we tell students, I've been in classes where teachers say, oh, just use context clues. And students are like, what's that? So this strategy really makes it clear for them. Look for maybe something in the context or in the words surrounding the word that you're trying to identify. See if there's a definition or maybe an explanation. See if there is a synonym to that word that's being used within the words surrounding. See if the word has maybe an opposite explanation so that you can kind of compare and contrast, like, oh, that's an opposite example of the word that I'm trying to understand. See if you can help students make inferences. See if there's some kind of punctuation key, clues that might help them. And there's lots of other clues that you can look up, and I'm going to, again, recommend to you to becoming an independent learner. Just do a quick Google search of context clues types, and you'll find lots of different ones you can teach your students, but these are kind of the general ones. So again, quick warm up, teach them that. Hey, here's a context clue. Here's an example. Let's see if you can practice this skill. And then again, turn them loose so that the next time they come across a word, when you say, use your context clues, they know what you're talking about. Now the next one, let's say there are no context clues, then we got to go to that word part piece, right? And so as I've included here, there is a suffix for the ERY, the eri, right? The haberdashery. And I would know, since I taught my students about these, right, that eri means like it denotes occupation, business, calling or condition, place or establishment, goods, products. And so I give examples like archery, cutlery, trickery, witchery. So with that said, I look at haberdashery and think, oh, it has something related to occupation, businesses, buying products, things like that. And so when I look at it now in the sentence, even down here, Lou was sent to the haberdashery, and I know that it's like a place of business. I don't necessarily have to know exactly what the place of business is to move on and understand the sentence. And I was able to come to that understanding because of my understanding of word parts. Now I'm going to kind of, again, focus this particular strategy on English. English, you do a really good job at teaching these Latin and Greek word parts. So I would really put that responsibility more on English teachers. But if the rest of you have, some key words and you're noticing, for example, in the words that you're identifying that you want students to learn, that there are some similar and common suffixes, prefixes, root words, teach those, right? By all means, teach them. That way, then it empowers them within the word bank that you provided for your students for the year. Essentially some word parts that they're familiar with so they can start to identify those words a little bit better. And I want to be clear, when I say word bank, I'm going back to last week that students need to learn a certain amount of words to make academic growth. And there are going to be words that you identify for sure. I'm not suggesting, based on my prior comment, that you're just going to identify a bunch of words, have them define these words and test them. I'm essentially saying you are going to define a core sense of either tier 2 or tier 3 words that students need. And you're using these strategies to help them acquire those specific words, as well as any other words they may need to acquire on their own that you aren't specifically identifying as words that are important for your course. I hope that makes sense. And if you have questions, you can always follow up with me on that. So I just want to make sure at this point that this makes sense. And I'm going to review. So again, Language Standard 4 is about helping your students become independent word learners. And then language, as you do so, you're going to teach specific strategies to your students on how to determine the meaning of unknown words or words that have different meanings than they're used to. For example, you will use context clues, you will use word parts, and the last two that I didn't mention is if haberdashery, A, have no knowledge of word parts, or B, there are no context clues, it might be helpful then to teach them how to use the dictionary, especially with phones, right? Students have phones at their fingertips, they can grab their phone, they can look up words, and then teaching them how to look up a word in a way, it's not just look up the word, but look up a word and say, okay, this is a noun, that's what this is, I understand the definition, or I'm reading the definition, I recognize maybe there's multiple definitions, trying to match those definitions to the context of where the word is being used so that I can make meaning of what this word means and so that I can learn from the text that's being provided from me.